Coast Guard is the principal federal agency in the maritime domain responsible for securing our borders, safeguarding our maritime commerce, ensuring environmental stewardship of our ports and waterways, interdicting drug trafficking and illegal immigration, and combating transnational crime. To be sure, the Coast Guard has a complex and diverse mission requiring significant resources, including vessels, aircraft, and especially personnel. To that end, Congress provided substantial funding in the FY 2016 Omnibus Appropriations to improve the readiness, recapitalize vessels and aircraft, modernize shore facilities, and recruit and retain a quality force. From my assessment, the Coast Guard's FY 17 budget request appears to largely sustain these efforts, along with some limited, though important recapitalization efforts to continue to address the Coast Guard's aging fleet, both of vessels and aircraft. Admiral, I know you support the President's budget, but I'm concerned there are unmet needs within this budget request. That said, as I told the Secretary, the FY 2017 DHS budget submission is a disappointment. Given the budget gimmicks and large gaps in funding throughout the request, tough decisions are necessary to ensure critical priority programs are adequately funded, and that all funding appropriated is, in fact, executable. While you have two vessel modernization programs underway, the NSC and the FRC, we're moving towards a third with the award of a detailed design contract on the OPC. Many of the remaining vessels in your fleet are past their useful life, and replacements are years away from being delivered. The planned acceleration of the development and production of a new polar icebreaker will further strain modernization efforts. And I understand in your State of the Coast Guard address, you stated a bigger force is needed, which will require even more resources. I look forward to hearing from you on what you see as your staffing requirements and what your strategy will be to fund this growth, especially in light of the recapitalization efforts that the Coast Guard will no doubt need to continue to address in future budget submissions. Admiral, we fully understand the challenge you face recruiting and retaining a quality force, sustaining operations with aging assets, recapitalizing for the future, and taking care of the Coast Guard families. No easy task in today's constrained fiscal environment. So I look forward to a candid discussion about unmet needs that are not addressed in this budget. We are relying upon you to explain how the request balances the nation's needs for both physical discipline and robust security. Before I turn to the Admiral for his statement, the text of this will be included in the record. And let me first recognize Mr. Price, who is sitting in for our distinguished ranking member, as she is a little bit under the weather today, for any remarks that he wishes to make. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're sorry to hear that Mr. Arbel Allard's not feeling well today, but I'm happy to sit in and to be a part of this hearing. Admiral, I want to welcome you, and let me just say a word as we begin this hearing, and then we'll return after the votes. I was pleased, as was Mr. Arbel Allard, that we were able to provide funding above the fiscal 16 request for the Coast Guard, including $928 million above the request for the Acquisitions, Construction, and Improvements Account, ACI, which funds the recapitalization of the Coast Guard air and marine assets, and $239 million above the request for operating expenses. Coast Guard has a critical set of missions that we must properly support. Now, the fiscal 17 request for the ACI account is $1.14 billion, which is $808 million below the fiscal 16 level. I don't anticipate that we'll be able to absolutely match the current year ACI appropriation in the fiscal 17 bill, but the request level is lower than what we would usually hope to see, and we're going to have to address that. Admiral, your predecessor thought properly recapitalizing the Coast Guard fleet would require at least $1.5 billion per year. So this morning, we will want to discuss the adequacy of the ACI request. We also want to look at the other components of the budget, see whether the request adequately supports your important missions, including personnel and operations funding that you require, and that most certainly will include the Coast Guard's Arctic strategy and the icebreaker request. So thank you again for joining us this morning. I look forward to our discussion.
We just see that the vote has been called and has started. Time is running. And they're getting kind of strict on getting there on time, so I guess we ought to recess now, get our votes done, and be back as soon as we can. Sorry about the delay, but that's the nature of Congress. Thank you. Admiral, I think you offered that you might forego your statement and just get right into the questions.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would just ask that my written statement be accepted as part of the official
All
record.
right, we'll
and
make a
in the
record as
interest
soon as I
of
get
time-
Mr. Price seated, and we'll get back in set. All right, we'll call this subcommittee back into session. Admiral, we were just talking off the record about you submitting your statement to us in writing, and we'll make it a part of the record, and we'll go straight to questioning. Is that satisfactory with you?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mr. Price, is that okay with you? All right, then we'll get started. Admiral, as has been pointed out, the missions of the Coast Guard run the gamut from search and rescue to ensuring the safe flow of commerce to combating criminal trafficking of drugs and people. And no one appreciates more than I do the successful execution of those missions. We know it's due to the sacrifice and service of men and women in the Coast Guard. It is our duty to provide them the best possible equipment and facilities we can. And we have been, in the last several appropriations bills, we've been doing just that. You state that your recapitalization remains your highest priority. However, many of the vessels in the Coast Guard operates today have reached or surpassed their projected service life. Admiral, the magnitude of recapitalization and modernization effort will require trade-offs annually. What strategic risks do you face to fund this recapitalization while executing the spectrum of missions assigned to the Coast Guard? What keeps you up at night?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. And what does help me sleep at night is we've also made a significant investment in the intelligence community. The Coast Guard is an official member of the intelligence community. And so when I look at managing risk, recognizing if the Coast Guard can't be at all places at all times, where must we be? And we look at transnational crime, drug flows, but more importantly, the illicit proceeds from those drug trafficking activities that have created violence in Central America, that 8 of 10 of the most violent countries in the world are not in the Mideast. They're right here in our backyard. These are countries that are thoroughfares to bring drugs into the United States for ultimate consumption, where 50,000 Americans died last year due to drug abuse. And many of these deaths in your districts as well. I know you're well aware of this fact. So that's one area where I cannot accept risk. I can't accept risk if there's a threat to the homeland, but at least I can make informed decisions and not shoot from the hip when it comes to risk if we don't get the full appropriation that we need to invest in the Coast Guard.
Admiral, funding a capital ship like the NSC is expensive. There's no question that the National Security Cutter is a tremendous asset and performing well above expectations. Excuse me. However, I believe it's just one of the many tools in the toolkit that the Coast Guard needs to successfully execute its complex and diverse missions. I'm concerned there may be a growing misperception that adding more national security cutters and foregoing other recapitalizations like the OPC would better serve the Coast Guard. Admiral, let me ask you today, just as I asked the Secretary last week, does the Coast Guard need more national security cutters to execute any of its 11 statutory missions?
Mr. Chairman, our number one priority is the offshore patrol cutter. And I always look at any new adds that might jeopardize that program of record. I am indebted to this subcommittee when a 9th National Security Cutter was added into our 16 appropriation. That could have potentially offset the offshore patrol cutter. In fact, this committee added the final $89 million for final design work. I'm encouraged that there's $100 million in long lead time materials in our 17 budget, but this is the platform that we really need to move out on because I look at, one, affordability, and I also look at what the out-year costs are of adding these newer platforms onto our base. The shore infrastructure cost alone is $140 million to home port that ship. The annual operating expenses, including salaries, fuel expenditures, is another $45 million. So I look long-term that these are ships that will be around for 60 years. And what is the Commandant, 3 or 4 Commandants from now, what are those challenges going to be of how do you sustain this mixed fleet? And when I look at our fleet mix analysis, that was 8 national security cutters, 25 offshore patrol cutters, 58 fast response cutters. We got it right. And so now we're going back to our force mix analysis again, now with the 9th. But I'm quite satisfied with where we are now that we have a 9th, but really the offshore patrol cutter is my #1 priority going forward.
Would a 10th national security cutter endanger other priority recapitalization programs like the offshore patrol cutter and fast response cutter, and the polar icebreaker, which is a huge ticket item? Let's be specific about that.
Specifically, absent any top-line relief to our acquisition budget, and actually it was me last year who said, you know, we need a reliable, predictable AC&I budget, a floor of $1.5 billion to keep all of these acquisition projects moving forward. But within that base, it does not give me the latitude, a 10th national security cutter, to build out the offshore patrol cutter, finish out the fast response cutter program, and now look at building new icebreakers as well. So something would have to give if we were to look at a 10th national security cutter. And so that would jeopardize our other programs within the funding climate that I see going forward.
And as your answer to the previous question was that the 11 statutory missions that you have are going, as far as that they relate to the national security cutter, are well served with the number that you've got now.
I'm happy with what we have.
Yes, sir. Okay. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to have to go to a Defense Subcommittee meeting right now because the Chief of Staff of the Army is from my district, and I need to get on him about some stuff. So, but I'll probably be back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, I want to read a sentence from the Coast Guard's recent Arctic Strategy paper. Numerous studies have examined national and Coast Guard shortfalls in the Arctic, from the need for additional icebreakers and long-range patrol vessels to improve communications and maritime domain awareness capabilities and aviation assets. Pretty large menu implied there by changes in Arctic waters, in the climate, and certainly international activity that we're looking at. I'd like to get us to as much of this as we can, but I do want to focus on the most immediate item, which is the icebreaker. You identify in this same study icebreaking capability as a significant gap in the Coast Guard's current fleet. So we're pleased that the President has announced he wants to expedite the acquisition of a new heavy polar icebreaker. This is not going to happen quickly, however, so I wonder if you could describe in more detail how the $150 million proposed in this budget for this year would be used. Is there any way to further expedite the acquisition? And let me just ask you a follow-up while I'm at it, because I want you to set the context here. We often hear that Russia has 20 to 30 icebreakers already. I don't know of what size or what quality, but maybe you can fill that in. How many do you think the Coast Guard will need? Do we need to match the Russian fleet, or is there a particular number that would give us the capability we need? And assuming we stay on track to begin constructing this first icebreaker by 2020, when could we realistically begin acquiring a second or third ship?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll first talk to the $150 million that have been identified in the President's budget for 2017. We're already moving out on hiring the acquisition staff professionals that would oversee the build-out of a heavy icebreaker. We've published in FedBiz Ops what the requirements for a heavy icebreaker are, and we've actually worked with at least 6 other stakeholders that have equity in the Arctic to identify what would they require of an Arctic heavy icebreaker. So we've done that up front, and now reaching out to industry. The shipbuilders of the United States are convinced that they can build a heavy icebreaker here in the United States. To accelerate this timeline, we're also looking at parent craft designs in other countries, but that design would be built here in the United States to accelerate that timeline. What the $150 million does is it incentivizes industry. It also provides a stable platform, as we've seen in years past with sequestration, budget control acts. In the last 4 years, we've been through a number of continuing resolutions, 2 funding lapses that would cause an acquisition of this magnitude to stall out at a point in time where the Polar Star, our only heavy icebreaker, has maybe 5 to 7 years of service life. We're doing everything we can to sustain it before its relief arrives. Russia has about 40 icebreakers. About 8 of those are heavy, and they have 6 more under construction today. This last year, I hosted all 8 of the Arctic Council nations, and through the State Department, I was allowed to invite Russia here to the United States to have a strategic dialogue and establish an Arctic Coast Guard forum, to not look at the Arctic as the next battlefield, but to look at the Arctic for the safety of life at sea, the amount of human activity, fisheries activities, indigenous populations, search and rescue, oil spill response, all of that. And the other Arctic Council nations look to the United States as the most powerful nation among the Arctic Council to really have a leadership role, because there are sovereignty issues at play up in the Arctic as well. So on a global scale, we're seeing internationally a desire for the United States to step up to the plate and be a more active player in the Arctic region as well. There's a high-latitude study that said, independent, said that the nation would require 3 heavy and 3 medium icebreakers. 1, it would be under consideration right now. 2, at least provide some self-rescue capability. And we'll have to see what happens over time. But right now, the baseline study says 3 heavy icebreakers, 3 medium, but not peer-to-peer competition with Russia to be, if you have 40, then we need 41. There's really no good return on investment when it comes to that.
That's your own projection you're talking about, 3 plus 3.
So mine is would be 3 heavy and 3 medium. And ironically, when I was an ensign many years ago, we actually had 7 icebreakers in the Coast Guard inventory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Admiral, good morning, sir. Want to thank you for your outstanding service to our country, and I want to thank the Coast Guard for all the great work that you all do. Before I ask my questions, a couple of things. I represent 3rd District of Tennessee, that is Chattanooga, and the Coast Guard does an exemplary job in my part of the world with the inland waterways, and I wanted to note that for the record. It's a very important function in our part of the world, and you all fulfill that very well. I also wanted another point of thanks. We hold 2 military academy days in our district. We're very proud of the fact that the 3rd District has provided some of the best students to our military academies, and all 5. And the Coast Guard, without fail, has sent personnel and alums. I understand you're a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy, to our Academy Days, and I want to thank you for that, because I want all the students in the 3rd District to have opportunities for our military academies, and the Coast Guard Academy is doing a great job, sir. Admiral, last year you testified that the offshore patrol cutter was the very top priority for the Coast Guard. As a result, Congress provided the funding needed for you to award a contract this fiscal year for detailed design that will lead to production in 2021. I am pleased to see that you included $100 million in your request to complete the design and procure the long lead time materials required to meet that date. However, I'm concerned, sir, with the timing of that award. Where does the process stand today, and how confident are you that you will be in a position to make that award before the end of this fiscal year?
Congressman, I have the utmost confidence that we will down select to 1 shipbuilder before the end of this fiscal year. The detailed design funding certainly provides the impetus for us to move forward. And quite frankly, the $100 million for long lead time materials for fiscal year 17 really sets that first platform up for success, because this will be a one-ship build initially before we go into full-rate production. But at least to get this first one on the starting blocks, we are very well postured going forward.
Follow-up question, what would be the impact to the program if that contract awarded needed to be shifted to early fiscal 17, sir?
Right now, I'd be loath to see any delay in this moving forward. When the first offshore patrol cutter is delivered in about the year 2021, the ships that it will replace, if I don't have to decommission them before that, will be reaching 55 years of service. In our fast response cutter fleet, we've had to take 2 ships offline, and we will decommission those just in the last 2 months because of deterioration. So really, we're at an inflection point right now where any delay on the offshore patrol cutter will impact frontline operations.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cuellar.
Chairman, thank you so much. And Admiral, thank you for your service and, of course, what your men and women do. Let me talk about immigration a little bit and part of the work that you all do. Traditionally, Cubans that were coming into the U.S. would cross the water and then go through Florida most of the time. The last 2-3 years, they've been coming through my hometown of Laredo, which is a port, a land port. In fact, the last 2 years, out of the 67,000 Cubans that came in, 47,000 of them came through a port of Laredo, land port. And as you know, the wet foot dry policy, the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act says basically if you touch the U.S., you get to stay. The wet foot policy came in, and basically, you know what that means. Now there's no more wet foot dry policy, at least for some of them, because they were coming in through Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and then Costa Rica to Nicaragua said put a hold on them. And then they would come in through Laredo, not come through a river, not come in and see Border Patrol. They actually would see only CBP, which are the men and women that we have at the bridges. They just come through a bridge, show their passport, 45 minutes or so, they come through, and that's it. And then they're fast track. 1 year, they become legal residents, and then in 3 years, they become U.S. citizens. They can ask for immediate federal benefits on the moment they come in. So you can understand what's been happening at the border. If you can tell us, and I'm looking at some numbers as to what you all have, I think for FY 2015, Coast Guard made a total of 3,800 maritime migrant interdictions, which 2,900 of them were Cuban nationals. Do you have any thoughts whether the Joint Task Force East is taking to extend the zone of security that helps us address this issue? Because now somebody got real smart and said, forget about the water. Well, they're still doing that, but now they're coming in the thousands. And what they're doing is now they're flying directly from Costa Rica, Iberia, Costa Rica. They'll fly into Nuevo Laredo, which is a city right across Laredo, and they fly in. They take a bus, maybe not a Uber, but they'll take a bus or a taxi, and then they get to the bridge and they're in. Any thoughts on how we address this issue, besides changing the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act, which I think is the magnet in this case?
Yes, Congressman. What happened in the last year and a half, there was a 4-fold increase in remittances that could be sent back to Cuba. So those who were the benefactor of these remittances then had the wherewithal to get on an airplane, get to Central America, ultimately Mexico, cross our land port of entry in Laredo, and as soon as they cross that border, their feet dry. Not everyone is the recipient of these remittances. Just in the last quarter, our numbers in maritime flow is up about 45% from where it was a year ago. And what we're seeing are those that don't get these remittances. And in fact, one of our most recent interdictions, we asked, how many of you is this the first time you've been stopped by the Coast Guard? Some, it was the 4th or 5th time. And says, well, what are you going to do when you go back? He says, well, we'll come back again. and they'll keep trying and trying until they ultimately go feet dry and are welcomed into the United States. So it's a policy, but it's also a policy that is folded in with, is Cuba a country that honors human rights? So if we're going to address this policy, I think in the same breath, we have to take stock of the government of Cuba, and is this a country that abides by human rights policies?
Right.
In the interim, we need to protect our borders.
Yeah, and I understand that, and certainly I think maybe when President Obama goes down there, he can address some of those issues because, you know, my good friend Mario Diaz-Balart and some of us, we've talked about that. But it's more political freedom. The Central Americans are escaping. They're escaping, it's a life and death situation for them because they're escaping drug cartels, trying to put them into prostitution, try to get them into join the gang. So it's a little different. But for those folks, we deport. So you can understand how the Central Americans and the Mexicans and even people on my side of the, on this side of the river feel it's a little unfair. One is trying to escape political freedom, and here they're trying to escape death in many cases. So it's, I understand what you're saying. It's a politically correct answer, but understand that at least us on the ground on the southern border, we're facing two folks coming in trying to escape the death, and I think you know this. We've talked about this. People are trying to escape the drug cartels and the violence and some of the most violent places in the world in Central America, and we deport them after a while. But here it's they touch and they're in. So I do understand your answer, but my question is, any way we can at least put a speed bump for some of the folks coming in on the land area? And I know you're more water, but any thoughts on that question?
Again, through the Joint Task Force approach, looking at who are the enablers of moving these individuals. They generally don't move on their own, so there is a human trafficking, organized crime element to this as well. And I think that's really what we need to be focusing our attention to as well. Exploiting this seam, this policy that we have in that regard. Our biggest challenge in the maritime domain, people taking such acts of desperation as to shoot themselves and not damage any vital organs, swallow bleach, use babies as fenders to keep our ships away from boarding them. But truly desperate measures to find a better life here in the United States, which is really no different than what we're seeing in Central America as well.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Young.
Thank you. Welcome, Admiral. Recently, I asked the Secretary Fox of the Department of Transportation about the new United Nations rule regarding international maritime organizations' requirement that shippers verify the weight of cargo and containers for steamships and terminal operators before being loaded onto vessels. You're aware of this issue?
I am, Congressman.
Okay, great, thanks. This is a new United Nations rule. I had a roundtable, an agriculture transportation roundtable a few weeks ago in my district, 3rd District in Iowa, and retailers, transportation folks, great way to get people together and discuss issues. But this was a real concern that a lot of our retailers had in the agriculture area and agriculture community. They're worried that there may be some real concerns here that could create delays and turmoil at our ports and repercussions here on our economies. And how can the retailers be assured that this is not going to be an issue that's going to choke things up and cause delays? And what current procedures are there for verifying cargo weight? And can you, again, confirm agriculture exporters that they'll not have to be really concerned about this regulation? And if there are unintended consequences that result from this, the July 1st date is coming up. Is there a way out of this? Can an extension be given to become compliant, or can there be an exemption altogether?
Again, Congressman, as you noted, this was run through the International Maritime Organization, not a regulatory process per se, but it really does apply to exporters to verify the weight of a container before it's loaded onto a ship and then exported to a foreign country. So if there's not verification of weight, then the shipper can refuse to load that particular container. Now, the same container, in all likelihood, has to go on another mode of conveyance, maybe the highway, maybe a train, where there are typically weight requirements as well. So it's rare where we encounter containers today that have not been weighed prior to loading aboard a ship, and it really is designed for safety of life at sea. What is the load of these containers with ships carrying upwards of 18,000 container equivalent units on there, but what is the ultimate weight of that? And then how are they loaded and how it might affect stability as well. We do not foresee any disruption to shipping activity. We've had significant outreach with both exporters, shippers at container terminals. One of my admirals was in Houston earlier this week. We had 2,000 people in attendance. So I think much of this is really in the communication realm right now, and we will continue to do that outreach effort and assure folks that there will not be a disruption in getting their products into the international commerce stream.
Well, would appreciate your commitment as the July 1st date comes that you'll be monitoring this and listening to the stakeholders and seeing what they're experiencing with this new rule. Secondly, like my colleague from Tennessee regarding inland waterways, Iowa is very unique. We have the Missouri River on one side, Mississippi on the other side, and it's a great way to help us get our agricultural goods to market. And can you share with the committee the work the Coast Guard is doing to protect our inland waterways and facilitate trade for a lot of the landlocked states that we have here in America?
Absolutely. We work closely with the Army Corps of Engineers. We work real close with the American Waterways operators. As you are well aware, this was almost a biblical flood season on our inland river system. And so there are occasions where the size of tows have to be broken down into smaller units so they can safely transit going downstream. We are making investments in our inland river tender fleet to keep those viable. The good news, they operate on fresh water, not salt. They're getting up there in age, but we're attending to that as well. We've had a lot of outreach with the operators as we look at being a little bit more efficient on how we mark the inland waterways. Do we need visual aids to navigation, or can you use electronic virtual aids to navigation? And try to strike a fine balance, but none of that is done in the absence of input and consultation with the American waterway operators. What we have seen is a reduction in flow coming downstream here of late because a year ago, I would say every day we're putting a new tank barge into the inland waterway system, and it was typically carrying Bakken crude going downriver. And a year ago, oil was triple what it is today in terms of value. So we're seeing an immediate impact there, but in terms of agricultural goods and the like, those are moving at within normal rates.
Well, thank you for mentioning ways to address some of these problems, and I do just urge you to keep that outreach there with the stakeholders and the operators because this is a big deal for not just the state of Iowa and the 3rd District, but other states as well. We mentioned Tennessee here, my colleague, the inland waterways, and so thank you for paying attention to this issue, and please stay engaged with it. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And Admiral, we're going to begin a second round of questioning, sir. I note that the Fast Response Cutter, the FRC, which you're requiring to replace the aging fleet of 110-foot patrol boats, is an important asset in the interdiction of illicit drugs. But the fiscal 2017 request only includes funding for 4 FRCs. This request, sir, is down from the 6 that were funded in fiscal 16. Is the goal still to acquire 58 fast response cutters? And if so, why is there a reduction in the number requested this year? Will this drop in production significantly delay your ability to complete this acquisition goal or negatively impact your ability to prosecute your interdiction missions?
Congressman, we looked at when the full production run of these fast response cutters need to be complete, and that year is 2023. The reason that year is important because that's when we go into full rate production on our offshore patrol cutter. So we need to close out one account before we go full bore on the offshore patrol cutter. We can go at risk this year with 4, but part of this is driven by a $1.1 billion ACNI budget. So those were some of the trade-offs that we had to make going forward with 4, but recognizing we need to get up to full rate production of 6 per year to deliver all 58 by 2023.
Yes, sir. I understand that you're in the process of contracting for the remaining 26 ships that will complete the program of record. What risk do you face if you are unable to reach an agreement on a fair and reasonable price for the remaining hulls? And what effect would a pause in production have not only on the cost of the ship, but also on your ability to meet the Coast Guard's missions?
Congressman, we are in, I would say, very emotional negotiations with the vendor as I speak today to come to closure on the cost of these final 26 cutters. We have a lot of experience with this program of record. We've held requirements steady, and we know what the unit cost is, and we know what a fair and reasonable price is. That's the subject of the negotiations going forward. But we need to come to closure on this within the next 2 months so we can move forward. Otherwise, and I'll just leave this vague, we will have to explore other options. But fair and reasonable is absolutely paramount. The immediate impact, as I said earlier, we had to take 2 110-foot patrol boats offline, and we will decommission them. It was on plan, but when they went in for their routine dry dock availability, all the more reason we need to keep this program moving along. But I'm encouraged that we will come to closure on these negotiations, which are critical, one, to the taxpayer. We get a good value, but more importantly, for our men and women who are operating these platforms and just doing fantastic things for our country out there on the water.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Price?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, I want to pick up on some of the issues raised regarding Cuban migration by my colleague, Mr. Cuellar. But first, I want to wrap up where we got cut off on the icebreaker and the Arctic strategy. I just want to make sure I understand the fiscal 17 request and how it relates to the bigger picture in terms of this this initial icebreaker project. You've asked for $150 million in the way of an initial appropriation for fiscal 17. That's with a total projected cost of how much?
Right now, we're using a place marker of $1 billion, but I would not use that as a figure to go on record with. But that is a nominal value right now until we do the full scoping, request for proposals, and then we see what comes back.
All right, and the way that would be parceled out over how many years? We're talking, what's the completion date?
Right now, we're talking upwards of 8 years to produce a heavy icebreaker. Part of that depends on if we can go with a parent craft design to accelerate that timeline.
8 years does seem like a very long timeline. Or is that not unusual for icebreakers?
Well, we haven't built a heavy icebreaker in over 40 years, Congressman, so there will have to be investments in technology by our industrial base to be able to build ships with that hull thickness, and so there will be some front-end investments required, which is why we've given this nominal value of $1 billion, because we don't know what it will take industry to be able to build this, because we have not built a ship of this type in such a long period of time.
That does bring to mind, though, the way you described the $150 million down payment. You talked about incentivizing industry. That was your phrase, and you implied that there might be some degree of incentivizing required to carry out this project. What does that mean exactly? And does this add up to obligating, you think, the entire $150 million in the fiscal year?
I can't project out whether we'd be able to obligate that $150 million, but certainly to accelerate detailed design and then get ourselves to construction of an icebreaker. Our biggest challenge in the past has been the vagaries in the budget process. We've seen our acquisition budget ebb and flow 40% in some cases, and even with a continuing resolution that prevents no new starts in acquisition has really challenged our ability to move forward in some of these large acquisition projects of ours. So what it does do is it provides us some surety to overlap a fiscal year, but more importantly, to keep industry keenly interested in this as well. It does signal to our industrial base that we are serious about making this particular investment.
Well, we are serious, and this committee is serious. I fully sympathize with the desire to protect the project against the vagaries of the process. Believe me, I understand that and share that concern. At the same time, we need to assure ourselves that there's some reasonable relationship between the amount requested and the amount likely to be actually obligated within the time frame. Let me turn to the questions Mr. Cuellar was raising. He's returned. He may want to raise some more himself. But with respect to the Cuban migration and the way it's stepped up since the President's opening to Cuba, which I fully support that. I know that there are some challenges to the Coast Guard, which result, however. And I want to focus on the people that are interdicted at sea as opposed to the land migration. First of all, I want to know if our budget, if the budget proposal is sufficient in what you anticipate in terms of interdiction and rescue. And then I just wish you could clarify the process. I understand wet foot, dry foot. I'm not sure I understand what differences, if any, might pertain to people you apprehend at sea. The process for returning these people to Cuba, and then how does that compare to the process for returning people, let's say, from the triangle countries of Central America? Mr. Cuellar has a very compelling point here. These people are all fleeing tough situations and threatening situations, but the threats are very different. And in the case of the Central Americans, in many cases, it's a more dire and more immediate threat. How do we treat these migrants who you pick up at sea, and do we treat the ones from Central America differently from the Cubans?
There are two different policies. So with the foot dry policy, when we apprehend Cuban migrants at sea, they're detained aboard our Coast Guard cutters. They go through an interview with an immigration service official to ascertain whether there's a bona fide claim of political asylum. And these are economic migrants. Very rarely does one raise to a threshold where there's a bona fide claim of political asylum.
This is the Cubans you're talking
These are the
about.
Cubans. So,
Right.
so they are repatriated. The other countries, historically, it's been Dominican Republic and Haiti that we apprehend at sea, and they are directly repatriated upon recovery aboard a Coast Guard cutter. In each and every one of these cases, first and foremost, these are actually safety of life at sea events. You don't see, like you do in the Mediterranean Sea, corpses coming ashore, so there is a human element to this as well. But it demonstrates the magnitude of risk that these people will go through to try to find a better life here in the United States. But these are two separate and distinct policies.
And is there any substantial number of people attempting to come through the Caribbean from these Central American countries, the ones under such duress at present?
No, Congressman. All of those typically arrive at our land ports of entry, but to date we are seeing few, if any, migrants taking to the water from the tri-border region of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Admiral, that bell that we hear is the voting bell, which necessitates our members to go and vote. As you know, we talked about this earlier. We might, if any of the members had a very brief question. I had some more, but I will defer. Mr. Cuellar, did you have any really quick questions? Just a real quick question. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, just real quick on the aids to navigation, entities that choose to advance the aids to navigation projects pursuant to your specifications. We're doing that because we did that for CBP. Myself and Chairman Carter, we added language to do reimbursement. Are you allowed to do that reimbursement? Are you allowed to get money if let's say, the city of Corpus Christi decides to move forward and advance that funding?
Congressman, right now we do not have a reimbursement vehicle, but we certainly, with private aids to navigation, we routinely consult with those to assure that they properly mark a federal waterway.
Okay. And like to follow up with your folks. I know you've met with them. I know that my friend Senator John Cornyn, I believe, sent a letter, and Senator Cruz also. So I just want to follow up on that and see if we can find a way. And Mr. Chairman, we're going to try to look at possibly we'll talk to Chairman Carter about the same thing we did for CBP to look at giving you authority to allow a reimbursement. That's a call from Chairman Carter, and we'll definitely work with them. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Cuellar. And Admiral, again, thank you for being before this subcommittee. We appreciate your testimony today, and we wish you and the Coast Guard the best in your endeavors.